The early morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as Dr. Michelle Thompson walked briskly through Terminal A. Her comfortable Nike sneakers made soft squeaking sounds against the shiny floor as she rolled her small carry-on suitcase behind her. Even after working for 16 straight hours, she carried herself with grace and confidence. Michelle had just finished performing a life-saving heart surgery on a 7-year-old boy. The operation had been complicated, but seeing the relieved smiles on the parents' faces made every exhausting minute worth it. Now, at 6:45 a.m., she was heading to catch her flight to San Francisco for an important medical conference where she would be one of the keynote speakers. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, Michelle adjusted her simple black blazer and smoothed down her natural curls. The airline staff member, a young man named Tom, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. I see you're on Flight 2876 to San Francisco. Would you like me to check your carry-on?" "No, thank you, Tom," Michelle replied with a tired but genuine smile. She had been a frequent flyer with the airline for the past 8 years, and many staff members knew her by name. As the head of pediatric cardiac surgery at Atlanta Memorial Hospital, she often traveled for conferences and special cases. After getting through security, Michelle stopped at her favorite coffee shop in the terminal. "The usual, Dr. T?" asked Maria, the barista who had been serving her morning coffee for the past 3 years. Mitchell nodded gratefully, and soon she was holding a large cup of strong black coffee with just a touch of honey, her perfect morning boost. Walking to gate the 7, Michelle checked her phone. There were several messages from her team updating her about the young patient's stable condition. She also had a text from her mother asking her to be careful and reminding her to eat something before the flight. Michelle smiled, thinking how her mother still treated her like a child even though she was 35 and a successful surgeon. The gate area was already crowded when she arrived. Business travelers in suits tacked away on their laptops while a few families tried to keep their children entertained. Mitchell found a quiet corner and pulled out her presentation notes. She wanted to review her speech about new techniques in pediatric heart surgery one more time before the flight. When boarding began, Michelle was among the first group called. She had specifically booked seat 2A in first class months ago. It was her favorite spot, by the window, close to the front, but not in the very first row. Years of traveling had taught her the best seats for a peaceful flight. As she walked down the jet bridge, Michelle thought about how far she had come. Growing up in a middle-class family in Detroit, she had worked incredibly hard to get where she was. Her parents had remortgaged their house to help pay for medical school, and she had spent countless nights studying while working part-time jobs. Now, at the top of her field, she could afford to travel comfortably and focus entirely on saving children's lives. The flight attendant at the door, a friendly-looking woman named Sarah Chen according to her name tag, checked Michelle's boarding pass and welcomed her aboard with a professional smile. Michelle made her way to her seat, efficiently stored her small suitcase in the overhead bin, and settled into the comfortable leather seat. She arranged her things as she always did: phone in the side pocket, coffee in the holder, and her medical journal on the seat next to her. Michelle sent a quick text to her mother confirming she was on the plane, then switched her phone to airplane mode. The first-class cabin slowly began to fill with other passengers, mostly business people in expensive suits who quietly took their seats. Looking out the window, Michelle let out a small sigh of contentment. In about 6 hours, she would be in San Francisco, ready to share her latest research with colleagues from around the world. But for now, she was looking forward to getting some much-needed rest. She had no way of knowing that her peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn. The cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, and the familiar sounds of the airplane readying for departure filled the air. Michelle took a sip of her coffee and closed her eyes briefly, enjoying these last few moments of calm before what would turn out to be one of the most memorable flights of her life. The peaceful atmosphere in first class was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of someone clearing their throat. Michelle opened her eyes and turned to see a woman standing in the aisle, staring at her with an impatient expression. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-50s, wore an expensive-looking beige suit and had her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice despite the quiet cabin. "I believe you're in my seat." She didn't phrase it as a question, but as a statement, her blue eyes fixed on Michelle with obvious disapproval. Michelle maintained her professional composure. something she had mastered after years of handling stressful situations in the operating room. "I'm in seat 2A, she replied calmly, reaching for her boarding pass. "Would you like to check our tickets?" The woman, who would soon be known across social media as Karen Whitfield, made no move to look at her own boarding pass. Instead, she shifted her designer handbag to her other shoulder and spoke even louder. "There must be some mistake. These are first-class seats." She emphasized the words first class, as if Michelle might not understand their meaning. Several nearby passengers looked up from their phones and laptops, their attention drawn to the growing tension. Mitchell noticed a businessman in 1C lower his newspaper to watch the scene unfold. "Yes, I'm aware these are first-class seats," Michelle responded, her voice steady but firm. "I purchased my ticket months ago." She held out her boarding pass, but Karen ignored it. "Flight attendant," Karen called out, waving her hand dramatically. "We have a situation here." Her voice carried through the cabin, causing more heads to turn. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant who had greeted Michelle earlier, quickly approached. "How can I help?" she asked professionally, looking between the two women. Karen gestured at Michelle with a manicured hand. "There seems to be some confusion about seating arrangements. Surely, there's been a mistake with the assignments." She gave Sarah a meaningful look, as if they shared some unspoken understanding. "Ma'am, may I see both of your boarding passes?" Sarah asked, maintaining her professional demeanor. Michelle immediately handed hers over, while Karen began digging through her expensive handbag, muttering about ridiculous situations and obvious mistakes. A young man sitting across the aisle started quietly recording the interaction on his phone. Michelle noticed but kept her attention focused on Sarah, who was now examining her boarding pass. "Dr. Thompson is in her correct seat, 2A, Sarah confirmed, looking at Karen. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Karen finally produced her ticket with a flourish. "This is outrageous. I always sit in first class when I travel for business. I'm a platinum member." Her voice had taken on a shrill quality that made several passengers wince. Sarah examined Karen's boarding pass carefully. Her expression changed slightly as she looked at it. "Ma'am, your assigned seat is actually 14C, in premium economy." Karen's face flushed red. "That's impossible. Check again. I specifically requested a first-class seat. Do you know who I am? I'm the vice president of marketing at—" "Your boarding pass clearly shows seat 14C," Sarah interrupted firmly but politely. "If you'd like to discuss an upgrade, we can check availability at the gate, but right now we need to continue boarding." Instead of moving, Karen planted her feet more firmly in the aisle. "I want to speak to the captain. This is unacceptable. I refuse to believe there hasn't been some sort of mix-up." She glanced at Michelle again, her meaning clear to everyone watching. The businessman in 1C had now openly turned around in his seat to observe. Mitchell noticed his legal pad had Civil Rights Law Office printed at the top. Two more passengers had their phones out, recording the scene. Sarah's expression remained professional, but her voice took on a more authoritative tone. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to proceed to your assigned seat in premium economy. We have a full flight today, and we need to complete boarding on schedule." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Michelle sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, years of handling high-pressure situations helping her maintain her dignity. But inside, her heart was racing, and she could feel the eyes of every passenger in first class on her. This was far from over, and she knew it. Karen's face had turned an even deeper shade of red as she continued to block the aisle. More passengers were backing up behind her, trying to reach their seats. The quiet morning atmosphere of the first-class cabin had completely disappeared, replaced by uncomfortable whispers and the sound of more phones being pulled out to record. "I demand to know how she got this seat," Karen said, pointing at Michelle. Her voice was getting louder with each word. "There must have been some sort of computer glitch with the upgrade system. I refuse to believe." "Ma'am," Sarah interrupted firmly, "Dr. Thompson is a regular first-class passenger with our airline. She booked and paid for this seat months ago. Now please." "Doctor?" Karen let out a sharp laugh that made several passengers flinch. "Oh, really? And what kind of doctor would that be?" Her tone dripped with disbelief. Michelle took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm the head of pediatric cardiac surgery at Atlanta Memorial Hospital." Her voice was calm but carried natural authority. I'm on my way to give a keynote speech at a medical conference in San Francisco. The businessman in 1C, who had been watching everything, spoke up. I've actually read about Dr. Thompson's groundbreaking work. She recently performed a revolutionary heart surgery that made national news. Karen's eyes darted between Michelle and the businessman. For a moment, she seemed unsure. Then her face hardened again. Well, I still think there's been some mistake. I've never had to sit in premium economy before. This is ridiculous. I want to speak to someone in charge. The head purser, a tall man named David Rodriguez, was already making his way down the aisle. Other passengers had complained about the delay, and word of the situation had reached the front of the plane. I'm the head purser on this flight, David said as he reached them. What seems to be the problem? Though he asked the question, the other flight attendants had already briefed him on the situation. Finally, Karen exclaimed, "Someone who can fix this. These people are trying to make me sit in premium economy when I clearly should be in first class. I'm a platinum member, and I always sit in first class." David checked both boarding passes again, though he already knew what they would show. "Ma'am, your boarding pass clearly shows seat 14C in premium economy. Dr. Thompson's pass shows seat 2 in first class. There's no mistake here." "But look at her. Does she look like she belongs in first class?" Karen blurted out, immediately causing gasps from nearby passengers. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. The young man across the aisle who had been recording muttered, "Oh no, she didn't." Several phones were now pointed directly at Karen. Michelle sat perfectly still, her face a mask of professional composure, though her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. The businessman in 1C was already pulling out his business card. Even Sarah, who had maintained perfect professionalism, looked shocked. David's expression turned stern. "Ma'am, that comment was completely inappropriate and discriminatory. This is your final warning. Either proceed to your assigned seat in premium economy immediately, or I will be forced to have you removed from this flight." "Removed?" Karen's voice rose to a screech. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have all of your jobs for this. This is completely unacceptable treatment of a loyal customer." Several passengers had started posting the videos online. One woman in row 3 was already on her phone, speaking quietly but intensely. "Yes, I'm watching it happen right now. This white woman is harassing a black female doctor on flight 2876. The situation had reached a boiling point. Other passengers were getting restless, checking their watches and muttering about missing connections. The boarding line in the jet bridge wasn't moving. 2 more flight attendants had arrived to help manage the growing crowd. Through it all, Michelle remained seated, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her posture perfect. Years of handling life and death situations in the operating room had taught her how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was personal, and despite her outward composure, each discriminatory comment stung like a physical blow. The next few moments would determine how this confrontation would end, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. The tension in the air was electric, and all eyes were focused on what would happen next. The situation in the first-class cabin had reached a critical point. The businessman in seat 1C, who had been quietly observing until now, stood up and introduced himself. "I'm James Washington, civil rights attorney," he said clearly, making sure his voice carried. "And I just recorded this entire incident." Karen's face flickered with uncertainty for the first time. She glanced at the phones pointed in her direction, suddenly seeming to realize how many people were recording her behavior. "I don't care who's recording," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I want to speak to the captain right now." She crossed her arms, still blocking the aisle despite David's warning. David spoke into his radio, and moments later, Captain Sarah Martinez emerged from the cockpit. She was a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. The cabin fell silent as she approached. "I understand we have a situation here," Captain Martinez said, her voice firm but calm. She looked at David, who quickly explained what had happened. "Ma'am," Captain Martinez addressed Karen directly, "I've been informed that you're refusing to sit in your assigned seat and have made discriminatory comments toward another passenger. Is this correct?" Karen's face flushed again. "That's not. I didn't. I just think there's been a mistake with the seating assignments." "There's no mistake," Captain Martinez stated firmly. She turned to Michelle. Dr. Thompson, are you comfortable continuing on this flight? Michelle nodded. Yes, Captain. I'd just like to get to San Francisco for my conference. The captain turned back to Karen. You have two choices. You can either proceed to your assigned seat in premium economy immediately and remain there quietly for the duration of the flight, or you can leave this aircraft. If you choose not to comply, I will have airport security remove you. What's your decision? A new voice spoke up from the growing crowd of passengers in the aisle. I have the whole thing on TikTok already. It's getting shares. It was a young woman in her 20s, holding up her phone. Another passenger called out, Twitter's picking it up too. Someone tagged your company, ma'am. They directed this last comment at Karen, whose face had begun to pale. James Washington, the civil rights attorney, stood up again. Dr. Thompson, I'd be happy to provide you with the video evidence I collected, along with my card. This is a clear case of discrimination in a public accommodation. Karen's composure finally cracked. She looked around the cabin, seeing nothing but disapproving faces and recording phones. The reality of her situation seemed to hit her all at once. I didn't mean... She stammered, her earlier arrogance disappearing. I just thought... Your decision, ma'am? Captain Martinez prompted. We need to depart on schedule. 2 airport security officers had appeared at the front of the cabin, responding to David's earlier call. They stood quietly, waiting to see if their intervention would be necessary. Karen's shoulders slumped. I'll go to my seat, she muttered, finally stepping out of the aisle. I'll escort you, David said firmly, picking up her carry-on bag. As they walked toward premium economy, passengers in first class began to applaud. Several people reached out to squeeze Michelle's shoulder or pat her arm as they passed by. An elderly woman across the aisle leaned over and whispered, You handled that with such grace, dear. James Washington turned in his seat again. Dr. Thompson, if you'd like to pursue this legally, I'd be happy to help. What happened here wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. Michelle took a deep breath, her hands finally unclenching in her lap. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll think about it. Captain Martinez stayed a moment longer. Dr. Thompson, on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for what you experienced. We have zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Would you like to file a formal complaint? Yes, Michelle said firmly. I would. Not just for myself, but for anyone else who might face this kind of treatment. As the final passengers took their seats and the cabin crew prepared for departure, Michelle could hear the distinct sounds of phones chiming with notifications. The incident was already spreading across social media. What had started as a simple flight to a medical conference had turned into something much bigger, a moment that would spark an important conversation about prejudice and privilege in modern America. David, the head purser, walked Karen through the first-class cabin toward premium economy. As they passed each row, passengers either turned away from her or stared directly at her with disapproving looks. The walk of shame seemed to last forever, with phones still recording her exit. When they reached premium economy, Karen discovered another problem. A young man was sitting in seat 14C, her assigned seat. David checked the passenger's ticket, and sure enough, he was in the right place. Ma'am, David said, checking Karen's boarding pass again, I apologize, but it seems there's been an error on your part. Your ticket is actually for yesterday's flight. Karen's face, which had just started to return to its normal color, turned bright red again. What? That's impossible. She grabbed the boarding pass from David's hand and stared at it. There it was in black and white. Her flight had been scheduled for the previous day. Several premium economy passengers had started recording this new development. Someone whispered, This is getting better by the minute. David spoke quietly but firmly. Ma'am, not only were you in the wrong seat, but you're on the wrong flight entirely. I'm afraid you'll need to leave the aircraft and speak with the gate agents about rebooking your travel. But my meeting. I have an important presentation this afternoon. Karen's voice had lost all its earlier authority and now sounded almost panicked. I'll escort you back to the gate, one of the security officers said, stepping forward. He had followed them just in case there was more trouble. As Karen was led back through the cabin, she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior watched in satisfaction. Some were already posting updates to their social media accounts. Plot twist. Karen wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. Back in first class, Michelle was receiving a series of heartfelt apologies from the crew. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant who at first tried to handle the situation, brought her a fresh cup of coffee and a warm cookie. Dr. Thompson, we're so sorry you had to experience that, Sarah said sincerely. Please let us know if there's anything else you need during the flight. James Washington, the civil rights attorney, turned around again. You know, Dr. Thompson, this incident perfectly illustrates the everyday discrimination that still exists in our society. Would you be willing to let me use this case to help create better airline policies? Michelle thought about all the times she had experienced similar situations, subtle and not so subtle assumptions about where she belonged. Yes, she said firmly. I would like that. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in departure. We had to address an issue with a passenger who is no longer on board. We'll be pushing back from the gate shortly. A quiet cheer went up from the passengers. Someone near the back of first class called out, "Way to handle it with class, Dr. Thompson." Through the window, Michelle could see Karen being escorted back into the terminal, gesturing wildly at the gate agents. Several passengers were sending their videos to news outlets and social media platforms. The incident was quickly going viral. David returned to first class and approached Michelle one more time. Dr. Thompson, our airline will be launching a full investigation into this incident. Would you be willing to provide a statement? Of course, Michelle replied. She took out her business card and handed it to him. You can reach me at my office after the conference. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Michelle closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The coffee Sarah had brought was perfect, hot and strong, just how she liked it. Her hands had stopped shaking, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because of what had happened to Karen, but because she had stood her ground with dignity. A young girl, about 10 years old, peeked over the seat in front of Michelle. My mom says you're a doctor who fixes kids' hearts, she said shyly. I think that's really cool. Michelle smiled, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. This was why she did what she did. This was why she had worked so hard to get where she was. And no amount of prejudice or discrimination would ever change that. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the full impact of what had happened began to spread through social media like wildfire. Passengers throughout the aircraft were checking their phones, watching the videos of the incident go viral in real time. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached Michelle's seat with a tablet in hand. Dr. Thompson, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but you might want to see this. She showed Michelle the screen, where a news website had already picked up the story. Renowned heart surgeon faces discrimination on flight. Incident goes viral. Michelle's phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages since the plane's Wi-Fi became available. Her hospital's public relations department had already sent 3 urgent emails. Even her mother had somehow seen the videos and was calling repeatedly. Dr. Thompson, a middle-aged woman 2 rows behind her, leaned forward. I just wanted to say, the same thing happened to me last month on a different airline. I didn't have the courage to stand up for myself like you did. Thank you. More passengers began sharing their own stories. A black businessman sitting in 3C talked about being questioned when using the first-class lounge. An Asian doctor described being asked if she was in the right line during priority boarding. James Washington, the civil rights attorney, had been busy making notes on his legal pad. He turned around again. The response online is overwhelming. Dr. Thompson, your incident is becoming a symbol of a much larger issue. Would you be willing to be interviewed when we land? Before Michelle could answer, a flight attendant from economy class came forward. She waited until there was a break in the conversation, then spoke quietly to Michelle. Ma'am, we have a situation in economy. There's a mother back there whose child is having some breathing issues. When she heard we have a doctor on board, Michelle immediately stood up. Of course, I'll come check on them. She followed the flight attendant to economy class, where a worried mother was trying to comfort her wheezing 6-year-old son. After examining the boy and helping him use his inhaler correctly, Michelle spent a few minutes explaining proper inhaler technique to his mother. As she walked back to her seat, passengers who had seen the viral videos recognized her, offering smiles and words of support. Back in first class, Sarah brought Michelle a fresh cup of coffee. That was kind of you to help, she said, especially after everything that happened. Michelle smiled. That's what doctors do. We help people who need it, regardless of where they're sitting on the plane. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the airline's corporate office. Dr. Thompson, we are deeply disturbed by the incident that occurred on our flight. Our CEO would like to speak with you personally when convenient. James Washington turned around once more. The videos have hit all major social platforms now. The hashtag #FirstClassDoc is trending. People are sharing their own stories of discrimination in travel. You've sparked an important conversation. A young professional woman across the aisle spoke up. My company's diversity and inclusion team just sent out an email about this incident. They're using it as a teaching moment. Michelle took a deep breath, feeling slightly overwhelmed by all the attention. She had never meant to become the face of this issue. She had just wanted to get to her conference and present her research on new pediatric heart surgery techniques. Sarah returned with another update. Dr. Thompson, several news outlets are requesting interviews when we land. Our media relations team will be waiting at the gate if you'd like their assistance. The same little girl who had spoken to her earlier peeked over the seat again. My mom says you're going to be famous now. Are you going to be on TV? Michelle smiled gently at the child. I just hope this helps make things better for everyone, she said. Sometimes it takes one small moment to create big changes. As the flight continued across the country, Michelle's story was being shared, discussed, and debated across the internet. What had started as one woman's prejudiced assumption had transformed into a national conversation about bias, privilege, and the small indignities that many people face daily. In her seat, Michelle opened her laptop to review her conference presentation. Tomorrow, she would talk about saving children's hearts. Today, unexpectedly, she had helped spark a different kind of healing. When the plane landed in San Francisco, Michelle was surprised to see 3 airline executives waiting at the gate. They stood out in their dark suits among the gathering of reporters who had somehow learned about her arrival time. Dr. Thompson, the most senior-looking executive, stepped forward. I'm Robert Chen, Vice President of Customer Experience. On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for your experience today. The other passengers filed past, many still recording on their phones. Several called out words of support as they walked by. You showed them, Dr. Thompson. Stay strong, doctor. Thank you for standing up. Robert Chen gestured toward a quiet corner of the gate area. We'd like to offer you lifetime platinum status with our airline, Dr. Thompson. It's the least we can do. We're also launching a full investigation into the incident. Meanwhile, across the country in Atlanta, Karen Whitfield was facing her own consequences. Her company's CEO had called an emergency meeting after their social media team reported that the company name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Karen sat in a conference room, watching clips of her behavior play on a large screen. Her face grew paler with each viewing. The company's head of human resources sat across from her, taking notes. Ms. Whitfield, the CEO said firmly, your actions today have brought significant negative attention to our company. The videos have been viewed millions of times. We've received thousands of complaints. Karen's voice trembled as she spoke. I can explain. I was stressed about my presentation, and I just assumed. That's exactly the problem, the HR director interrupted. Your assumptions and actions displayed clear racial bias. We're placing you on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Back in San Francisco, Michelle was dealing with her own kind of overwhelming attention. News crews followed her through the airport, shoving questions. Dr. Thompson, how do you feel about becoming a symbol of the fight against discrimination? What message do you have for others who face similar prejudice? Will you be taking legal action? James Washington, the civil rights attorney who had been on the flight, stepped in to help. He had stayed with Michelle after landing and was now acting as an impromptu buffer between her and the press. Dr. Thompson will be making a formal statement later, he announced to the reporters. Right now, she needs to prepare for her medical conference, where she'll be presenting life-saving research about pediatric heart surgery. Michelle's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The hospital board in Atlanta had sent a message of full support. 3 major morning shows wanted to book her for interviews. Civil rights organizations were reaching out to make her a spokesperson. The airline's social media team was working overtime. Their first post addressing the incident had already received hundreds of thousands of likes. We have zero tolerance for discrimination. We are investigating this incident and taking immediate action. In Atlanta, Karen's daughter called her, crying, "Mom, you're all over TikTok. How could you do this? My friends are texting me about it. This is so embarrassing." Karen's hands shook as she opened her laptop. Her email inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers. Some expressed disappointment, others anger. The professional network she had built over 20 years was crumbling in real time. Her company released a public statement. "We are aware of the incident involving one of our employees. The behavior shown in the viral videos does not reflect our company's values. We have placed the employee on immediate administrative leave and are conducting a thorough investigation." Meanwhile, Michelle finally reached her hotel room in San Francisco. She sat on the bed, exhausted but proud that she had maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal. Her mother called again. "Baby, I'm so proud of you," her mother said, voice full of emotion. "But I'm also sad that you had to go through this. Things were supposed to be better for your generation." Michelle thought about the little girl on the plane who had been impressed by her being a doctor. "Maybe this will help make things better, Mom. Sometimes it takes one person standing their ground to create change." As evening fell in San Francisco, both women's lives had been forever changed by that morning's events. Michelle had become an unexpected symbol of resistance against everyday discrimination, while Karen was facing the harsh consequences of her prejudiced assumptions. 3 weeks after the flight incident, Michelle sat in the green room of a major morning news show in New York. It was her 5th television interview this month. But this one felt different. Today, she wasn't appearing alone. The producer stuck her head in the door. "Dr. Thompson, we're ready for you. And the airline CEO is already on set." As Michelle walked onto the brightly lit stage, she saw Richard Martinez, the airline's CEO, standing up to greet her. The host, Angela Chen, smiled warmly at both of them. "Today, we're following up on a story that touched millions," Angela began once they were live. 3 weeks ago, a video of discrimination on a flight went viral. Now, we're here with both Dr. Michelle Thompson and the airline's CEO to announce some major changes in the industry. Richard Martinez leaned forward in his chair. "What happened to Dr. Thompson was unacceptable, but instead of just apologizing, we decided to take action. Today, we're announcing mandatory anti-bias training for all our employees, from gate agents to pilots." Michelle nodded. "What's even more important is that 5 other major airlines have agreed to adopt these same training programs. Real change happens when everyone works together." Back in Atlanta, Karen Whitfield sat in her home office, watching the interview on her laptop. After 2 weeks of diversity training and counseling sessions, she had started to understand the depth of her mistakes. Her resignation letter had been accepted by her company yesterday. The morning show host turned to Michelle. "Dr. Thompson, your medical conference presentation about new heart surgery techniques has also gone viral. Can you tell us about that?" Michelle's face lit up. "Yes, that's actually the most important outcome of all this. The attention has helped us secure funding for 200 pediatric heart surgeries for children who couldn't afford them. Sometimes, good things can come from difficult situations." The host smiled. "And I understand you've started a new foundation." "Yes," Michelle replied. "The First Class Future Foundation. We're working to support minority students who want to enter medical school. The airline has become our first major corporate sponsor." The camera panned to show pictures of Michelle in her operating room, performing the delicate heart surgeries that had always been her true passion. Then it showed clips from her recent speaking tour at medical schools, where lecture halls were packed with young students of all backgrounds. Meanwhile, in a high school classroom in Detroit, students watched the interview on a smartboard. Their teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, turned to the class. "This is why I showed you this story. One person's courage to stand up for what's right can create lasting change." A student raised her hand. "I read that the civil rights lawyer from the plane is helping write new airline policies. Is that true?" "Yes," Ms. Rodriguez answered. "James Washington has been working with several airlines to develop clear guidelines about passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies." Back in the TV studio, the host asked her final question. "Dr. Thompson, what would you say to that woman from the flight that you were watching today?" Michelle thought carefully before answering. "I would say that we all have prejudices we need to face. The important thing is to learn from our mistakes and work to become better people." In her home office, Karen wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to Michelle's words. She opened her email and began typing a long overdue apology letter. The next day, Michelle was back in her operating room at Atlanta Memorial Hospital, preparing for surgery. As she scrubbed in, a nurse told her that the parents of her young patient had seen her on TV. They said seeing you stand up to discrimination while still being so dedicated to helping children gave them hope, the nurse said. They feel blessed to have you as their son's doctor. Michelle smiled behind her surgical mask as she walked into the operating room. This was where she belonged, not on TV shows or at press conferences, but helping children's hearts beat stronger. As she began the surgery, Michelle thought about how one moment on a morning flight had created ripples of change throughout society. But more importantly, she thought about the young life under her skilled hands, and all the future doctors who might follow in her footsteps, facing fewer barriers because of what had happened that day. The story had started with one woman's prejudice, but it had ended with positive changes that would help countless people in the future. And that, Michelle thought, was the best ending anyone could hope for.